And I don't know how we're going to get around that. But anyway, we're looking at the Genesis 1 story. Or more correctly, we're trying to catch a glimpse of the picture of reality that is behind or underneath the story. I've talked several times about the fact that when you create a worldview or a thought system, you have to begin by making some assumptions, some of which pertain to reality itself. And these things are hidden like a basement. And yet they are determinative, because what you put down there governs what will be allowed in the rest of the system. Like when you build a house and you build a foundation, you kind of have to stick with that shape, right? You can have a few protrusions here and there, but the size of the house, the weight of the house, the whole thing is determined by what you did with the footings, which is actually one of the easiest things to build in a house. You just got to pour concrete down on dirt in a certain way, right? Put a bit of reinforcing rod, and there you go. But so looking at this, and I think I probably have a little less to say this afternoon than I do in the other ones, but we'll see how it goes. I might be overcome by what I call audience effect. You know, when you're speaking and people are listening, sometimes you keep on going. Anyway, so far we've noticed from this story that time is a component of reality, that time is linear, that there is a deity, and I enjoyed some comments over lunch, you know, that especially if you studied philosophy of religion in college, you went through all these arguments that favor belief in God, but I'm intrigued by the fact that God is announced here. And I pointed out that what that's telling us is that God is a foundational component of the biblical worldview. We don't debate it, we adopt it and say, well, that's where we begin. And I might make this mention, you know, you all know the first verse of John, the first chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was, you can actually translate divine. The Word was divine. And if you know anything about Greek culture and Greek language, the word that is translated in English as word is the word logos. And if you study the etymology of that word, you will discover that amongst the Greeks, that word referred to the foundational something that held the cosmos together. They thought it was some elemental force of some kind. And so you realize that when John wrote that verse, it shocked the socks off of them. Because he said that the elemental force that holds the cosmos together is not gravity or it's a person. And, you know, this is why to the gospel, to the Greeks, the gospel is foolishness. They say, what is this? But from a Christian perspective, it really tells you that the starting point of the Christian faith is radically different from any other one. It begins with deity, who initiates things, not with rationale and this and that and everything else, like amongst the philosophers, okay? So, reality is a duality with natural and supernatural components. That's what we looked at this morning. So I want to move on to several other things, reminding you again that we have to think about inference. And here's one observation. That one of the things we learn from the creation story is that the beginning was personal. This is very significant, as I hope you will see here in the next few minutes. And I like what Francis Schaeffer did. Francis Schaeffer was a philosopher and an apologist who actually established the L'Abri Institute in Switzerland. And many young people went there and stayed for 6 months, and he taught them about some of these foundational truths of Christianity. And he pointed out that when you look at the stories of origins, there are very few options that have emerged in history. One is you could say there's no rational explanation. The other one is you could say there is a rational explanation. Those are the two most foundational positions you can adopt. And of course, if you adopt the no rational position, then we're at a loss. If there's no rational explanation, then there's no rational explanation. I hope you all have a happy day and figure out something that brings you joy, right? But if you pick the other option, if there is a rational explanation, he pointed out that there are three possibilities that emerge if you go for the rational one. Number one, everything came from nothing. And I'm sure all of you have seen The Sound of Music more than once. And in that movie, there's a song that teaches you the truth about this. What does it say? Thank you. Nothing comes from nothing. And Francis Schaeffer was funny because he said, well, the people who say that everything came from nothing, they don't really begin with nothing. They begin with some electrical spark or some this or that. And so he says, if you get into this discussion, make sure they begin from nothing, nothing. That was his argument. Nothing, nothing. That if you begin with nothing, nothing, nothing comes from nothing. It never will. Okay? So that first one, people offer it as a solution, but it's actually absurd. It can never happen. The second option is that time and random chance produced everything, including sentience. Now, I have been a creationist all my life, first of all because I was taught that as a child, but as I've gotten older, it seems to me by far the most rational position. Because, as I read about natural selection, I don't see it being able to produce this kind of complexity and life that we have. First of all, a lot of mutations are detrimental to the entity where they experience. And the other is that, I just think about it, you had to have a rooster and a chicken evolve at the same time in the same place. They don't live that long. And just the complexity of things, there's too much evidence, in my opinion, for design. And that's before you even get to the question of mind or sentience. That there's no known mechanism where sentience emerges from biological assemblies. And I know there are people arguing that as the brain got more complex evolutionarily, that sentience emerged on its own. Well, that's not a scientific statement. There's no evidence of that. And at the present moment, and I know there's some danger here that maybe they will discover something, but at the present moment, this is a huge problem because there's no pathway from random chance to sentience. Okay? So the second one, I think, becomes problematic. The third one is to postulate the existence of a sentient being who produced everything, including replications of himself. And I like this next observation here. It's quite amazing how many of the frustrating foundational problems are resolved if you posit the presence of a divine person who created. And I've noticed in some of the reading I've been doing that Darwinian evolution is on the skids, folks. It's not, in a popular world it's not, but in the scientific world it's on the skids. Okay, people are realizing it's not tenable, and so they're looking for other options. And I chuckle at one of the suggestions that life was seeded here by aliens. Okay? And actually that would solve some of the problems with evolution, right? So maybe we should declare God to be an alien, and then he'll gain more respectability amongst people. But anyway, I'm being a little facetious here. But you understand that by proposing that aliens did this, we have sentient beings of some kind who now populated life on this earth, and okay, we can go from there. But the idea of random chance doing it, if you postulate the existence of a sentient being who started this, a lot of those pieces that are difficult fall together. Another thing that emerges from this, in the beginning, God, is the question, okay, so what kind of deity is this? Right, what does this story tell us? And here I'm thinking beyond those first few words, what kind of deity does this story refer to? And it becomes very quickly obvious, if you know anything about pagan mythology, that the God of Genesis 1 is very, very different from the gods of antiquity. Okay? If you read Greek mythology, and I've done very little of that, but if you read it, it's full of ugly, nasty stories about the behaviors of the gods. They're vindictive, they steal each other's wives, they kill, they pillage, they punish people in horrible ways, they kill each other and make other things out of the body of the god that died. It's full of this. And not only that, you really wonder if the gods are sovereign or if they're controlled by the fates, that the fates do things to the gods. Now, where'd the fates come from? I don't know. They're these elemental forces that are adrift somewhere, and the gods have to be subjected to them. See? And so the God of Genesis 1 is vastly different from all that mayhem. Okay, very different. What do you find here? Well, the Genesis deity is entirely sovereign. You don't find him consulting with anybody else. You don't find him with any competitors. Okay? You don't find any consorts. Many of the creation stories amongst the pagans involved a male and a female deity cohabiting, and then the earth is born. You have none of that in this particular story. He has enormous power, so that even his words, when he speaks, things happen. And I know we as adults, especially parents, wish we had even some of that power in our words, that when we spoke, our children immediately complied, right? This is fascinating, by the way, because when you get into the Bible and it talks about the Word of God, there's an assumption there that the Word of God, once spoken, will produce effect. And you know that text that if you cast your bread on the water, what will happen? Yeah, see, that the Word of God is like that. If you throw it out there, it will happen. And I'm sure all of you know of instances where somebody heard the Word of God and they said, this is truth, and this truth is... Ooh, my voice is running out. That this truth is powerful enough that I'm going to orient my life to it, and becomes a life-changing thing. You know, in my retirement, I enjoy driving big trucks. I drive Kenworths and Peterbilts and things like that. I have a friend who's a farmer in the Walla Walla Valley, and he often calls me and says, "Dave, what are you doing today? You know, can you haul some hay?" And I had the misfortune of breaking down one day. The engine destroyed itself and was way out on Battle Mountain, if you know where that is, south of Pendleton, up in the hills, no phone coverage, you know. And fortunately, he was behind me and, of course, stopped to help. So we ended up having the truck towed, and he and I rode in the other truck together, and we had an interesting conversation. He was not born as an Adventist. And I asked him, "So, Richard," I said, what caused you to become an Adventist? He said, "When I heard the story of the great controversy," he said, "that made more sense to me than anything I ever heard." He said, "That is true." And he says, "I still think it's the case. You know, the controversy between good and evil that plays in our lives," he said, that made me an Adventist and keeps me. Thank you kindly. I thought I would escape without having to drink anymore. I drank a lot at lunchtime, but... So, the power of words, this God is amazing in that regard. This God acts within time and space, and in light of what I said earlier today, I think this has a significance that you already understand, that this is not a God who's outside of time. He has access to time. He acts within time and in space and produces effect. Okay, this God is also personable. I love that passage. In fact, it creates one of the nicest pictures I know of in the Bible, where it talks about how in the cool of the evening, what did God do? He came down and he sat and talked with Adam and Eve. And I mean, what a picture of a deity. The Almighty himself, who made the heavens and earth, comes down to talk to the beings he has made. They're very personable. This is a good one. Yeah, he's not implacable, not fixed in timelessness. And another piece, and this you have to go beyond the creation story, but I am fascinated by the fact that when trouble came to this earth, God didn't walk away. He didn't walk away. And if you know your history, you know that when the tabernacle was built, where was it placed? In the middle of the encampment. And you realize the statement that's making. God is saying to the children of Israel, yes, sin has created a mess that you have to live in, but I have news for you. I'm going to be in the middle of your mess. And when you need help, don't run away from me. Come and see me. Come and let's talk together, and I have a solution for your problem. And so when an Israelite would come walking across that open quadrangle there in the middle of the camp, headed for the temple, that's basically what undergirded their journey. Okay, I have a God who, when I'm in trouble, I go see him, and he is able to help take care of this problem. Okay, it's a beautiful picture. This deity is not like the deities where if you did wrong, you got cooked somehow. Okay. I like this piece. I think in that story you see God enjoying his creative activity. Why do I say that? Well, at the end of every day, what does he do? He looks at it and he says what? Wow, this is good. I like this. Right? And it happens 7 times, and then at the end he doesn't just say it's good, he said it's very good. And I've chuckled about this because If you look at some of the ancient creation stories, the events of creation are rather brief. God gives birth to the earth, or a fish's body is sectioned and the earth appears in there. It's a fairly short chronology. I think the ancients, when they read this story, they said, wow, he took his sweet time. He took a whole 7 days to do this and enjoyed it all along the way. And so when people today freak out, well, how could God have done this in 7 days? I think to myself, you're reading the story the wrong way. Okay? A supernatural being could have done it like this. But God took a whole 7 days. He liked this. Saw what it was made. He liked it. It was good. He's happy. See? I like to look at the story this way. God enjoyed what he was doing. Okay? I mentioned this. He's personable. Notice he set the humans in a paradise where they had all they needed. I think that indicates a very thoughtful God. He created a garden for them and said, this is where you can live and everything is here. You have to do work tending the garden. It's not just going to, but this is your home. And I think about that. Wouldn't you like it if somebody gave you a home that had everything you needed and all you had to do is keep maintaining it without paying $900,000? No, never mind. Okay. Here's a very significant point. In this story, God is separate from what he makes. Okay? In fact, you get the impression that God is over here and what he's making is over there. It's not connected to God. God is making something over there. And this actually mitigates against the idea of creation being an emanation of God. And so it disallows pantheism and panentheism. Now, pantheism, I think you all know, means that there's some divine element in elements of creation. Okay? Panentheism is the opposite of that everything is a part of God. Okay? And both of these are disallowed by the creation story, that God is not intertwined with his is not intertwined with his creation. It's not all interconnected. And it means by extension that the material parts of the cosmos are not worthy of worship. They have no divine element. They're not connected to God. Okay? They have a purpose, but they're not that. Of course, in pagan religions, it was often the material parts of the universe that were worshipped as gods. And if not the articles themselves, then you made a replication of it and worshipped that. And I'm fascinated by what's said in Romans chapter 1, where Paul says that those who subvert the word of God and who deny it, they enter a downward spiral, he says, into darkness. And what's the final thing they do? They worship the things of nature, or they create replications of it and ascribe divine prerogatives to the things that they've made themselves. See, so I think it was Chesterton who said that when you give up believing God, you don't go to believe in nothing, you believe in anything. See, it's not a journey. Yeah, I said this here, that the elements of the nature have a purpose, a function, which is what? To differentiate day and night and the seasons. That's what they function as, okay? But they're not there to be worshipped. Okay? One of the pieces of this idea that God creates something over there is called mediation, and this has caused me a lot of interesting thought, because mediation is a term that refers to God endowing his creation with some capacity to function on its own. You see that every plant has seed and can replicate itself. Human beings are told to reproduce, that there's a capacity also to choose. And so what God is doing is he's giving his creation a measure of independence. Okay, that's what mediation refers to. This is actually something that's of great significance, and we should be thoughtful about it, because it includes making real choices, but some implications are, and this one bothers a lot of people. One of the implications is that God is not in control of everything because he chose not to be. Now, I'm hearing this a lot in Adventist communities, that never mind, God is in control of everything. That's not true. God has chosen not to be in control of everything. If you want to make God in control of everything, then you make him responsible for sin as well. Right? See, God has chosen not to be in charge of everything. In fact, he's designated you and me to be in charge of some things. And if you deny that, then God becomes very meddlesome. Right? And I think part of the reason for this is that this latitude allows for us to have choice, which is a prerequisite to love. And I will say to you that your theology about Christianity will change dramatically if you really begin with the fact that God is love. Most Christian theologies do not begin with that. They begin with the idea that God is holy and just, and He's got an eye on you, and if you mess up, He keeps record of it, and at the end of things, if the bad outweighs the good, you're going down. That's how most Christian theology functions, see. But if God is a God of love, then you would have to approach this in a very different way, and a key component here is the volitional nature of love. Can you require somebody to love another person? And I joke with college kids about this. I say, well, how about if we required a young man to love one of the young women here, that you must do this? How well would that work? Any of you see the movie Fiddler on the Roof? I saw it a long time ago. And by the way, I'm the world's worst at movies. I don't know anything hardly about movies, and I pay a price for that on a college campus where they know everything about all movies. I don't know anything about them. And I've teased them, and I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you can make a list of movies that are good for my mind and my soul, I'll watch them. And I've had a bunch of students say, we'll get you a list, but in 20 years of teaching, I never had a list given to me. Which leads me to think that maybe a lot of movies are not good for the mind or the soul. But anyway, in that movie, it's fascinating because the chief actors, the mother and father in the family, were married by arranged marriage. And there comes this one point where they're having a discussion because the second daughter is in love and wants to run away with a tailor. And the mother and father, the father's very upset. He says, what is this thing called love, you know? And he asked his wife, well, did you love me when you married me? Anybody remember the response? She said, I didn't even know you. You know? But of course, love grew. But love is an additional component, okay? And this is why when I do weddings, I remind people that they are doing this to themselves, right? They are taking this pledge themselves, that they're not being forced into it. And I often ask people at a wedding, are you coming to this event of your own volition? See? And we all know that if somebody was forced to get married, that they could probably get it annulled because, you know, love requires volition. And I think this is one reason why in the Bible the ability to choose is highly prized, that God has paid a very high price for protecting that. And I think, for example, of the story of Lucifer, if you had been God and Lucifer pulled his stunt, what would you have done? Well, a lot of people say, well, why didn't you just go zap? End of problem. Well, it'd be the end of that problem, but it'd be the creation of some other very big problems, see? And so love is kind of a messy business, but it does win out. And, you know, I think that this story, by God creating something over there and giving it, mediating some of its own authority, He leaves room for real human choice, which actually means that human responsibility is also a factor. I was talking at lunch to a former student who told me that when he was in college, he was an agnostic, and he took one of my classes, and he talked to me afterwards, and he said he didn't like the answers I got because it made agnosticism look tentative. But he talked about how he's read a lot about biological determinism and, you know, natural determinism, that if there's no supernatural element and you are not really responsible, then you are merely operating based on your biological functions, the brain waves and the instincts and so forth. Well, what happens to personal responsibility? You know, when a lion acts by instinct and jumps on a wildebeest and devours it, we don't have a court case and say the lion is guilty. But if a human did that to another human, we would have a big to-do. Why? Well, because we're actually not driven just by instinct. We have a measure of personal responsibility, and if you give that up, then I'm not sure I want to live in your neighborhood. See? Another interesting thing about this story is that it gives to us our concept of matter. I've mentioned several times here that there are many forms of dualism that see the non-material or spiritual world as ideal and the material world as bad or evil. And a distinction gets drawn between the spiritual and the carnal, between the sacred and the secular. And I would like to say I think that that distinction is not appropriate in Christianity. We should not talk about the sacred and the secular. Okay? And this is a wonderful student quote from a former student. She wrote, "The existing ontology in the ancient world was that the origin of material things was a result of cosmic conflict or was associated with fate. The gods either produced material elements as offspring, created for the purposes of stirring up or overcoming conflict, or the faceless power of fate which controlled the gods made them create lesser things. In any case, the created world was subject to the whims, disabilities, vengeance, or forgetfulness of the gods. It was deemed intrinsically evil from its origin and was surrounded by chaos." Now, you realize that if you hold that particular idea of matter, it has some major effects. And it has had major effects in Christianity. Okay? And it's the idea that we should focus on the spiritual and we should diminish the material. So if you become rich, that's bad. Okay? If you experience pleasure, that's bad. It's part of the material realm. That the biological drives of the body are bad. Okay? And so we deny those and we suppress those. It's produced a number of interesting things in Christianity. One is there's been a drive toward asceticism. Who are the holiest people in Christianity? Well, they're the ones who go and live in a cave and eat brown rice and drink water and nothing else. And they only eat a little bit because they're reflecting on God and doing holy things. It's what drives the idea of a celibate clergy. Because you see, sexual function here is part of carnality and it's bad. That's why you can find in some Christian theologies that people should indulge in sexual activity only if they want to procreate, not for any pleasure or bonding. It should only be for procreation. This is why priests are celibate, because they don't then indulge their sexual appetite. They are above that. Okay, and I think there's plenty of evidence that that idea creates carnage of another kind. See, a very interesting flip side to this is some people say, well, if the body is bad and it's going to die, then who cares what we do? So eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we'll be dead. And so you have famous people like the priest who said he needed to live in a very bawdy, what word do I want here? Lascivious manner to demonstrate how great is the grace of God. See? If God can save me with all my misbehavior, then the grace of God is magnificent. See? So it's fueled this funny thing. I think that we are far better off to be much more holistic about this, okay? That the creation itself is said to be good, and so in its place, all of the functions of life are good. Now, I mentioned earlier today that because of sin, we are advised to put a bridle on our instincts, okay? That if you don't do that, you will suffer from what somebody called the tyranny of desires. Okay? If you like food, people, you better put a bridle on your appetite, otherwise what? You could become a glutton. Okay? If you find physical affection important, you better put a bridle on it, or you could become lustful. If you like intellectual stimulation, you better put a bridle on it, or you could become arrogant. That any function that's even necessary for life can become the instrument of our demise and our destruction. So it's not like they are bad inherently, but they need to be bridled. Yeah. So in Genesis 1, matter is not evil. Living in the material world is not a diminished existence. The whole system is very good. And so there's no distinction between the sacred and the secular. And I want you to think about that. Because if you eliminate that distinction, then the whole of life is something that should be lived openly before God and other human beings. Okay? It's not like I have to be good on Sabbath and I can be a hooligan the rest of the week. It's like whether I eat or whether I drink or whatever I do, it should be done to the glory of God, because our experience is a holistic one. We are in a good world, a world that was made to be good. Okay? It's damaged, but it's not inherently evil. This, by the way, has had a very big effect on things, and I guess I'll come to that. I mentioned also order out of chaos. Wow, this is a very big one in the minds of ancient people. because they believed that you had to perform certain rituals to keep chaos at bay. Have any of you ever been to a wedding and thrown rice at the bride? Could I see your hands, please? All right. I have some very disturbing news for you. That you involved yourself in an ancient pagan fertility rite. You didn't know that. Have any of you ever put a wreath up anywhere? I have some disturbing news for you, that you have borrowed from the pagan world. Okay? What else can I say? Well, I'm not going to, I'll leave that one alone. If you ever walked up front in a church and said vows to each other, this is a pagan model of a wedding. Okay? Now, I'm not saying things that are pagan are bad, and I once got into a lot of trouble in church because I said that I thought it was fine for Christians to celebrate the holidays, as long as, depending on how they did it. And there was a woman in church that day who believed that all holidays that had any links to paganism should have been banned. And she was very angry in the lobby. She told me, if I had known what you were going to say, I would never have come here with my children today. And anyway, my point is that not everything that the pagans invented are bad. If you wear enclosed shoes, guess where they were invented? By pagans. I'm very grateful for my enclosed shoes, especially in wintertime. They have no moral component that I know of. See, but the point here is that in the ancient world, there's a whole cycle of fertility that's tied to the annual cycles of the seasons. You know that in the fall, when the seasons were declining, the days were getting shorter, things were dying, and the pagans were saying, "Uh-oh, life is dying here, and we're reverting back to a chaotic existence. If it gets dark continually, then everything will die and it'll be a big mess." And so they rejoiced a great deal when the cycle of the sun changed. That's why I mentioned earlier they had a big feast on December 25. And then in the springtime, they celebrated fertility with rabbits and eggs. Oh, I meant to ask, any of you ever painted an Easter egg? Okay. Yeah, that's a pagan custom. It's been robbed of its paganism, but it's just a cultural thing we do. But they were fascinated by fertility. If you keep an egg warm, it turns to a chicken. How could that be? And a grain of rice, if you plant it, it produces 100 grains. See? And rabbits, how prolific are they? And so the hope is that by celebrating these things, they would prompt the gods to enable the cycle of fertility to continue, which kept chaos at bay. So the whole cycle of life, and by the way, this is why the Israelites were told, don't get involved in the pagan religions. They are fertility religions. See? And this is why you find all the carrying on with prostitutes. You know that in the city of Corinth, when Paul went there, that the temple, I think to Athena, I forget who the temple was to, had 1,000 cult prostitutes who engaged in the sexual activity for religious purposes, ostensibly, to keep the cycle of life going. Remind the gods that this should continue. See, so those religions are very different, but order from chaos, the orderly thing, and we should not miss the fact that where does the Bible end up? What's the condition of the earth at the end? You know, when it talks about the bottomless pit, linguistically that is linked to the verse in Genesis about without form and void. In other words, that after the destruction of this earth, when Jesus comes, it will be like it was before God created it, and created life here. And then God will remake it. There'll be a new heaven and a new earth. So you have this whole cycle that plays out. It's all around the question of chaos and order. And I'm pretty convinced, by the way, that the ancients were not interested in how God created. That's our big question. How did God do this? They didn't care about that. What they marveled at is that, wow, this is an amazing story of a God who, by speaking, brought order out of chaos. Wow, amazing. See, so I think the story had some apologetic and even prophylactic, is that a word I want value in its time? Okay. I want to talk here a little bit about the Cappadocian Fathers, because if you notice there, a major reason science emerged in the Christian context is because of this idea that we come from an orderly cosmos. Okay? And I ran across this here, that there were 4 things that the Cappadocian Fathers lived in what's today central Turkey, and very early on in Christian history, I think around 300 and some, They tangled with this question of matter and God. And here are some of the things they decided. Because the cosmos is the creation of a rational God who has also made us in his image, it follows that the cosmos is in principle comprehensible by the human mind. You realize how important that was? That's one of the foundational reasons why science emerged in the Christian world and not in some other world. And if you study civilizations back then, that some of those other cultures, like the Islamic one and like the Chinese one, were more sophisticated than Europe was. So why did science emerge? Well, this is one reason. They decided that if God had created this world and it was good, that it must be orderly and comprehensible by humans, and so they set about to try and understand it. The second one, because the cosmos is a creation by God as a free act of his will and not an emanation, the cosmos has relative autonomy. Not everything that happens is the direct will of God. And I am very comforted by that. As I mentioned, I think at church, that I have a good friend who's got a terminal illness, cancer, a very rare form. Only 1,000 cases a year appear in the United States, and she is one of them. And I think to myself, well, you know what? Not everything that happens is because of God. I'm comforted by that. I don't attribute her illness to some activity of God. And I know some people say, well, God did this for a reason. No, he didn't. Okay? I don't think he did. That God is not meddling in all the affairs of things. And notice they say we must investigate the empirical facts by careful observation. A third one, because Scripture says that God created the heavens and the earth, it follows that the heavenly bodies are not, as Aristotle said, made of a substance different from the elements that comprise the earth. So I'm sorry to tell you, the moon is not made of cheese. Okay? You may have thought that, but not so. Right? And then this fourth one, because of the work of God in incarnation, we may use material means for the advancement of human salvation. This actually had a massive effect on medicine, because it allowed the church to use Greek medicine instead of doing as the Jewish community did there, of avoiding anything that had to do with Greek medicine. And of course, that's the beginning of all the discoveries of things in the natural world that are good for us. And I mean, the development of medicine is astonishing. I know some of you here are physicians, and I marvel. I wonder when medical school will have to go to add another year, because of all the new things that people have learned and that we keep experimenting with. It's a growing field. And I sometimes say to students, you know, if you had to go under the knife on surgery, who would you choose? A veteran surgeon from the Civil War. This guy could amputate your leg in a minute. Okay? Versus a recent graduate from a modern medical school. Who would you pick for your surgeon? I don't see anybody picking the Civil War era surgeon. Okay? And I'm in that category. You know why? Two main reasons. One, he had no anesthetic. And if you're going to cut my leg off, I don't want to be around while you do it. But the second one is he knew nothing about germ theory. And so they would take the instruments from one infected wound to another, and I think there are estimates that in the Civil War more people died of infection than of their wound, of the gunshot. See, and what's made the difference between the Civil War era surgeon and the modern one today? Well, it's basically scientific discoveries. See, yeah, and I keep hearing that we're on the verges of some enormous changes in the treatment of cancer and so forth, and I look forward to that day. I know some great advances have taken place, but I am quite fascinated by the immunology experiments where they would use your own immune system to fight the disease, which sounds good to me. Another thing this story teaches us about is the Sabbath. And I've thought about the Sabbath a lot. You know, the Sabbath is both a time and an experience. And I think we need to think of it that way. In Adventist history, we've spent a lot of time arguing about the time of the Sabbath, and the seventh day is the Sabbath. And you read back and listen to old evangelists, and they argue about how it changed from Sabbath to Sunday. Those are good arguments and so forth, but unfortunately we've missed sometimes the fact that the Sabbath is not just a day, it's also an experience. And I remember when I was in college, I had a friend there who was studying to be a nurse. And after 2 years of study, he qualified to be a CNA. And so on Sabbath, he would work a double shift because it was allowed. You know, this is approved work by Adventists. You can work as a nurse. And so he would work double shift on Sabbath. And I remember asking him one day, I said, Rob, so I understand your justification in terms of legality, but I said, what happens to your Sabbaths? Where do you have a Sabbath? And he looked at me in a shocked state of mind. I said, well, yeah, you need, the Sabbath is not just a matter of do's and don'ts, it's a matter of backing away from the rough and tumble of life. It's getting away from the rat race, and you notice that it provides an escape from the rat race, because even if you win the rat race, you'll still be a rat. Okay, I had a friend tell me that, and I said, yeah, that's true. You can get to the top of the heap and find you're still a rat. The Sabbath is a wonderful gift given to humans that takes you away from all the stress and strain that usually accompanies so much of living, and you get to enjoy good things. And I was very grateful for a conversation. I didn't like the conversation. It was a difficult and prolonged conversation, but the end result was good, with a Jewish gentleman who pointed out that the Jewish approach to the Sabbath is very different from the Protestant one. The Protestant one, we think about all the things we do not do on Sabbath. And you have to clean your house beforehand, and you have to shower and get your shoes polished, and you put all the secular books away, and then you don't swim. You can wade up to your knees, but you don't swim. And you shouldn't eat a big meal on Sabbath. And what are the other rules? I don't remember all of them. But he said, you focus on keeping the Sabbath. He said, in my community, we celebrate the Sabbath. He said, we are very happy when the Sabbath comes. In fact, he says, if you go to Jerusalem on a Friday night and you go to the Wailing Wall, you will see people are dancing, they are singing, they dress themselves in fine clothes. They are very happy that the Sabbath is coming. And I have to tell you that conversation changed my approach to the Sabbath. I had never really thought about this. That the Sabbath, Jesus said, is a gift. I'm giving you this gift. This gift is a day to de-stress. This is a day not to worry about all the things you worry about. This is a day to gather with fellow believers. It's a day to enjoy human interaction. In the conservative Jewish community, it's a day when you should have sexual relations with your spouse. Okay, that's kind of one of the requirements. But it looks backward to creation. It looks forward to the kingdom. And I have thought for a long time, and I know Ellen White says this, that if people respected and observed the Sabbath, faith in God would probably have survived much better and thrived much more than it does. And I commend the Jewish community here, because they have been keeping the Sabbath for over 5,000 years. And you know, it's the one religion that does not have a central holy place anymore. Okay? Catholicism has the Vatican. What does Adventism have? Washington, D.C.? I don't know. You know, that Mormons have Salt Lake City, that we have places where we anchor our faith. In the Jewish community, there is not such a thing. But they anchor it in the Bible, in the Torah, and in the Sabbath. Those are things that keep their faith community functioning. And I think in Adventism, it happens this way as well. And we should cherish the Sabbath and rejoice in it, I think, more than we do. Also, this story is the only place known where the origins of the 7-day week can be found. I've had some interesting conversations about that. Now, you could say, well, you take the monthly cycle of the moon, and, you know, you can divide that up and find 7 days. But I would say, well, if God created the world, that's an obvious conclusion, right? 7 days makes the month. I don't know why it's 365 and a quarter days. And I don't know why every month isn't 28 days. But anyway, remember that the calendar is a human invention. But the 7-day week is fascinating because it's not tied to any cosmic event. Okay? The day is tied to morning and evening. The month is tied to the cycle of the moon. The year to the cycle of the earth. What's the week tied to? It's tied only to this. And I understand that during the French Revolution, they tried to change a 7-day week to a 10-day week. But it messed people up. And so this is another thing that I find very interesting here about this. So I'm coming to a point of summary. I want to just reflect for a few minutes on all the things I've told you, because I want you to go away from this realizing that there's a grandeur to the Genesis 1 story, even the first 4 words, that is completely obscured by the caustic debate between creationists and evolutionists. What does this story do? It gives us an idea that time is a real element of reality. It gives us that God is not timeless. Okay, reality is not timeless, and nor is God. It teaches us that time is linear and not circular. It teaches us that there was a point of beginning for life on this earth. The grand reality consists of 2 harmoniously functioning entities, a supernatural and a natural, that there is a deity, that the deity is interactive within time and space, that this deity is unlike any of the other gods, that creation and the deity are separate entities, they are not enmeshed, that the material realm is understandable, that truth can be defined as an accurate description of what is real, that the material realm is not bad, that order came out of chaos, creation has some latitude of its own in which to operate, the Sabbath is a time and an experience, the end. So, I kind of ran through those in a hurry, but I have actually come to love the Genesis 1 story. Okay? And yes, it is kind of written in almost a poetic sense, but that doesn't detract from it. It has a structure to it that's beautiful with those 2 parallels that have summary statements for and after. But the point I'm trying to make here is that your whole concept of reality and of God comes from this story. Okay? It comes out of this story. That's why I think it's the first story in the Bible. It sets up the whole picture of reality and sets us on a path that begins at a point of origin and journeys to a point of destiny. And I wish those who argue about creation and evolution well in their quest, but I like to think of this as a gift from God to contextualize our lives and to help us in our journey from start to finish. So I think we have time for a few questions if you would like to ask them. There being none, I guess we can go home. No.
Oh, there'll be questions.
Well, I hate to be the first one to ask a question because this is more of a personal question for you, but I would imagine in your role at the university, you have the dual blessing of being able to really challenge yourself with this study, but then also see it lived out in the real world, making impact on the lives of students. Are there any ways outside of the university setting that you've been able to also achieve kind of those 2 things?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I spent half of my professional life out of the academy, pastoring churches, and as I look back on it, those years are all different, and I kind of remember them as separate entities. But when you get into an institution, you do the same thing over and over again. I could tell you in 1 year that 2 years from now at 11 o'clock I'll be teaching systematic theology on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and so I can't differentiate those. But getting out from the university, I mean, that's one reason why I do things like this. That's one reason I go out and preach in various places. The last time I spoke, somebody got after me and said, I need a YouTube channel. I don't know anything about a YouTube channel except that they exist. So some people say I should publish this. It's very difficult to write this. I have 4 books half written, you know, and they need editing, and editing is 4 times more difficult than writing. So I'll just tell you, I take your suggestion under advisement. Thank you very much, Brent.
I have a question about the Sabbath. I'm probably going to butcher it a little bit because I haven't read Charles Taylor's Secular Age, but I know he talks a little bit about different ways to approach things, whether it's transcendental or pagan approach or different things. And like you had said with the Sabbath, some people have it more of a legalistic time. This is what you do, what you don't do. And then some Adventists, you know, and I think Charles Taylor would call it more the pagan approach, that you emphasize the health benefits. You want to observe the Sabbath because that's what athletes do, or, you know, kind of all the different things you get out of it. But then I think there's also kind of what he describes as the transcendental And is that kind of more what you're getting to, or could you expand on it maybe in that context a little bit?
Well, no, I think that I think one of the best things that can happen to humans is to suddenly gain a sense of something that's so big that they become filled with awe, A-W-E. That to run into something that strikes you as transcendent, I think, is a very good experience for humans. And it gives you a clue that you are actually not that big, okay? That you're kind of small, and that there's a dimension of life that is much bigger than you are. And I think a sense of the transcendent is at the heart of what it means to worship. You know, the word worship is a condensation of the words worthship. That you establish, you ascribe worth to something, and you stand in awe of that. And that's what we do when we come to worship God. We recognize the awesome nature of God, and we are filled with awe and adoration. That's what worship is. Okay, and that's why when you see somebody stand by an antique Corvette and go, "Whoa!" What have they just done? They have ascribed worth to there, and they are in awe of it. They have worshipped. Okay, see? And I'm being a little facetious here, but it'd be nice if we could think of that way of God. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, that's great. I guess probably maybe one more question unless someone else raises their hand. If someone has someone in high school or college or something, or 20s, or honestly any stage of life where they're kind of wrestling with this, and if you were to have a book recommendation for them. I know in your class I read Universe Next Door by Sire, but
Yeah.
I don't know what your go-to recommendation is.
Can you get the book
for
out of
people.
my briefcase there? It's a blue one, a little one called, yeah, that one. If you are a thoughtful person and want to struggle with some of this, Leslie Newbegin's book, Proper Confidence, is a good one, okay? And this is a book, actually, that I haven't read to its completion because I keep fascinated by the assumptions that are made in the beginning, and I go back. I've read this many times, but never all the way to the end. Another book that I found very, very useful, and I happened upon this in a strange way. I bought it at a used book sale. It's entitled What is Human by T.M. Kitwood. This is a book in which, I bought it, I think I paid 50 cents for it, and it sat in my office for 10 years. And I kept saying, I need to read this book, I need to read this book. Well, one day I sat down, it's a little book, it's not a big book. I sat down and read this thing. And I have to tell you that he talks about existentialism, and he talks about humanism, and then the last section he talks about Christianity. And that is the most fascinating description of, and transparent description of Christianity I think I've ever read. This guy was a chemist, and he was teaching in Uganda, in a town where the Nile River runs out of Lake Victoria, and there's a big hydroelectric dam called, it's at Jinja, and he's teaching chemistry there, but he writes this book. And I wanted to make sure I had enough copies, so I bought 2. And I've underlined it, I've read it. When I get in an airplane, I take one of those with me, and I read that over again. I would almost like to memorize the whole thing. Okay, so that's another one. Leslie Newbegin has another one entitled Truth and Authority in Modernity. It's a little book. That one has some easy sections to read, but if you don't know anything about posits and presuppositions, at some points you won't be able to understand it. And I've read that book probably 6 or 7 times, and I will tell you every time I read it, I say, oh, I see something I hadn't seen before. So it's not a lightweight book. I think Mere Christianity, the first chapter, is a very useful one. I think, Jesus Among Other Gods is one written by Ravi Zacharias. I've used that in this class for 20 years, but unfortunately Ravi Zacharias, after he died, it became apparent that he was inappropriate with some women at the gym he used to go to, and they didn't say anything till after he died. So the last time I required that, the students protested and said, look, we don't read a book that was written by this guy. And I said, wait a minute. I said, that doesn't mean that what he said was bad. It means that his own personal life was not what it was, but his thoughts are actually quite good in that book. I find that book to be very interesting because Ravi Zacharias was an Indian. He was not from European culture. but he reflects on Jesus in comparison to other religious systems. And it's actually a very engaging book, Jesus Among Other Gods. What else can I think of? Well, there's one I've enjoyed. It's a very old book, T.Y. Mullins, Why Christianity? It's a question mark. And the format of the book is not that good, but some of the argumentations. He wrote back in the 30s, I think, when the big debate was going on with Huxley and atheism and evolutionary. But oh, and I mentioned Philip Johnson, his books on asking the right questions. I put one up last night, a picture of him. He has several. Philip Johnson, he was a lawyer, and he points out how the assumptions we make govern the thought process. And he accuses scientists of adopting certain presuppositions and then creating theories that are not based on science, but based on the theory. And for example, if you look in a biology book, you've seen that progression from an ape to a human. How much of that is scientifically driven? Well, we don't have specimens of all of those, okay? That's how it should be if evolutionary theory holds, see? And so he points out, oh, if you want another one, Science's Blind Spot is an interesting book. And I forget who the author is, Science's Blind Spot. Or if you want to stir yourself up, Jonathan Wells' The Icons of Evolution. That's a shocking book, where he points out that a lot of the claims that are made by evolutionists, even the white moth, dark moth theories, he's been able to demonstrate that that was a staged event, that the person who wrote that planted the moths. And so he says there are a lot of myths that are popular, but they're not based in science. And of course, I'll mention one more. This is a theological book, The Cross of Christ by John Stott. If you want to see the theological significance of the cross, that's a great book. It's the best book on the cross in 100 years. John R.W. Stott.
Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me.